Welcome to this lecture on gender theory, film issues and debates. What we'll be looking at today is two key ideas. One, which you've come across before through the male gaze and Laura Mulvey, but also a little bit of what we know as queer theory, and that is put forward by Judith Butler. More about that later. So what do we mean by gender, and do films construct or reflect gender? Well, when we look at early feminist critiques, they focus mainly on the stereotypes of women and their negative impact on female spectators, simply cause and effect idea. This is advocated for corrected positive images of women. So in other words, if you've got a bad woman or a woman who's very submissive, what we need is good positive role models, simply done, simply put forward. In the early 1970s, Claire Johnston was one of the first to draw on semiotics and Lacanian psychoanalysis, suggesting that cinema provides a male myth of woman. The woman in classical cinema serves as an empty sign exchanged by men, the object rather than the subject of design. In other words, women had no agency. Johnston was critical of Hollywood cinema, but also saw it as an important site for study and intervention. She called for an alternative narrative cinema, in other words, one built round women. Together, these two frameworks provided film theorists with ways of thinking about how the viewer as a subject participates in the meaning of the film. In other words, how we, when we're watching a film, are actively engaged in what we see. Mainly because semiotics is based around the theory of signs, a tool for analysing how meaning is produced through language and ideology. Everything around us that we see is a sign of something, and we construct meanings behind them. Psychoanalytical theory is a theory of the subject as constituted through sexual difference, and more about that later. Laura Mulvey, we've come across before, took this a step further. She's a British media theorist and film theorist, still alive today, and through her publication in 1975 called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, she combined this and looked at mainly classical Hollywood cinema and how we as a viewer construct what we see. And of course, as I say, we're familiar with this, very familiar with this, through the idea of the male gaze. She claimed that the representation of women in Hollywood cinema, classical Hollywood cinema, was as an aspect of visual pleasure. That cinema produces gendered subjects, not sexual subjects, but gendered subjects. And we've talked about the difference before. That men in films are active, women are passive. You, as a spectator, will identify with the characters. And because of the positioning of the camera, lighting, the roles, all decisions set up these positions, you thought about yourself as the one looking and not being looked at. Psychoanalytical theory, as it is related to film culture, this is not about psychoanalyzing the characters, but mechanisms of viewing this spectatorship. More than the act of looking, the gaze is a viewing relationship characteristic of a particular set of social circumstances. So if we live in a patriarchal society, we will automatically look at certain characters, certain individuals, in a certain way. Even if it was wrong, it influenced a body of work that was very influential. So combining this idea of psychoanalysis and semiotics, we get a better understanding of film. Analysis does not always have to be tied up with the economy or class. In other words, we can look at it beyond those concepts, look at it in terms of gender. We can see a picture here of Sigmund Freud, who was the founder of psychoanalysis, and one of the key things that he brought to the fore was the idea of the unconscious. And how it's applied in film studies is that the unconscious shapes cinematic practices, i.e. a male gives pleasure and is the dominant pleasure. Male ambivalence towards a female figure leads towards extreme positions, to devalue, punish, to save, or to make a pedestal figure out of her, or even to fetishize her. Feminist theorists present Freud's model of the unconscious of sexuality as an accurate description of the place of women in the phallogeocentric culture, not as a necessarily or naturally built condition, but one specific to contemporary society. So in other words, this is gendered as opposed to sex-based. In cinema, the spectator is made to identify with the male look because the camera films from the optical as well as the libidinal, in other words, what we have inside us, point of view of the male character. In other words, there are three looks. There's the character who will look at each other, there's the viewer who looks at the screen, and the camera also looking at the event being filmed. And here we have a key example of that from Rear Window, which is a film all about the male gaze, the male looking at. We can even see a camera there, and James Stewart as Jeffrey, who is the key person who looks. Pleasure can function in two ways. One is through scopophilia. This is through the pleasure in looking at objects. In other words, the voyeuristic gaze. We like to watch. Hence, in the cinema, we are watching. People are portraying activities that give us pleasure. And there's also narcissism. This is identification with the on-screen male protagonist as the controlling figure. In other words, we're not just looking at these figures, we want to be them, especially the male figure. Think of James Bond. Everybody wants to be him, even female viewers. Within the patriarchal order, women are the other, the empty object through which identity is constructed. This becomes problematic for women's identities. In other words, women are always being the object, not the subject, being looked at. This is where the idea of a woman become the object in the film arises. So you can have, why can't we have, female protagonists in terms of counter cinema? The gaze is not necessarily male, but to own and activate the gaze, given our language and structure of the unconscious, is to be in the masculine position. So in other words, we can't escape it. The gaze is masculine within the terms of the patriarchal society and structure. Well, is her argument complicit with normative heterosexual order? In other words, can you have a gay gaze, as it were? Because when we look at women, is it always women and men looking at women? Can not other people get pleasure out of looking at the women as opposed to just men? Are there other forms of spectatorship? How can she deny forms of female spectatorial pleasure in the cinema? In other words, how can you account for the fact that women get pleasure from watching? Do men see women as representing their castrated selves? This is going a little bit more deeper in the sense that the idea that women and men aren't separated but are part of a whole. So we're not separated by us not being separated. We are actually looking at a part of ourselves. Does the emphasis on psychoanalysis overemphasize the binary of gender between male and female, like as I mentioned before? What about films with women protagonists? Mary Ann Doan and others began to consider the female spectator in relation to the woman's film, so where we get a female protagonist who has agency and has to make choices. What about those? If we live in a patriarchal society, though, going back to this key idea, patriarchy, this is the idea that the phallus has power. So the fact that guns are designed in a certain way means that they are phallic and therefore are powerful. I mentioned before, in this whole idea of the male gaze, the gaze of the camera is the male gaze is active, the female passive. The spectator is made to identify with the male gaze because the camera points from the optical as well as the libidinal point of view. The other key thing I've mentioned before is that they have agency, or certainly men have agency. In classical Hollywood cinema, the male protagonist has agency. He is active and powerful. He is the agent around whom the dramatic action unfolds. The female character is passive and powerless. Mulvey argues that women have two roles in the film: as an object of erotic desire for the characters and an object for erotic desire for the audience. Moving on though, Judith Butler presents something slightly different. Her contemporary approach, much more recent than the male gaze theory, is that gender is not a result of nature but is socially constructed. That is to say, male and female behaviour and roles are not the result of biology but are constructed and reinforced through media and culture. Butler argues that there are a number of exaggerated, disruptive, tongue-in-cheek representations of masculinity and femininity which draw attention to the idea that gender is socially constructed and cause what she refers to as gender trouble. In other words, people who like to bend or traditionally constructed ideas of gender. Here we have certain examples of that. We can see that where deliberately men and women have taken on certain different roles that are attributed to both their own sex and also to the opposite sex. Time and time again we see this much more in various different parts of culture. Butler's theories of gender trouble can also be linked to queer theory, which explores and challenges the way in which the heterosexual is constructed as normal and the media has limited the representations of gay men and women. It has been suggested, for example, Hollywood film constructs and portrays images of what is normal, which is the happy heterosexual couples are often represented in terms of sin and sickness. Can you think of any examples that support or refute this? Queer theory challenges the traditionally held assumptions that there is a binary divide between gay and heterosexuality and suggests that sexual identity is much more fluid. An example of the fluidity of gender and sexuality can be seen in the character of Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean. In this film, the character uses an ironic and over-the-top performance of a pirate, which includes wearing an over-elaborate costume and eye makeup, using feminine and camp gestures and avoiding anything that could be interpreted as machismo. So what is a summary of Butler's key points on gender representation and queer theory? Nothing within your identity is fixed. Your identity is little more than a pile of social and cultural things which you have previously expressed or which have been said about you. In other words, traditional society. There is not really an inner self. We come to believe we are one through the repetition and discourse about it. So, in other words, the way we act is which we call our normal everyday things, is done through repetition, and therefore that solidifies this idea of who we are. Gender, like other aspects of identity, is a performance. So in other words, every aspect of your life you can change, and it can be done through performance, because life is almost like a performance, though not necessarily a consciously chosen one. Again, this is reinforced through repetition. People can therefore change. A person who explored this through her work is somebody like Madonna, who uses the idea that she can be both male and female when she wants to. It's worth looking at her videos of some of the music, certainly in the late 80s and early 90s. The binary divide between masculinity and femininity is a social construct. In other words, it's something we've created ourselves. It's built on the binary divide between men and women, which is also a social construction. We should challenge the traditional views of masculinity, femininity and sexuality by causing gender trouble. And this is certainly something that Pedro Almodovar does through his films, which we will be exploring.